Keith Wood, good morning to you. How are you?
I'm very good, albeit a bit confused with this, Ger. I've struggled with it a little. It's been interesting.
I understand Colin Buig ruined your day yesterday when he texted you wondering, would you have a think about this? It's a good piece and we'd like to do it with you. And you're like, okay. But then all of a sudden your brain took over and you got busy.
Well, it was it was Monday, and it ruined Monday afternoon. I had an awful lot of work on, and all I could think about was this bloody list. But I have thought about it a fair bit over the last period of time because of the international rugby experience that's been built in Limerick. And they do have an element for this, for people to be able to build their own best ever 15. They've 270 or 80 players that are linked over the last number of years, so you can kind of build your own one out. But it's funny, when we were building all those names in, I never fully got my head around building my own, which was kind of interesting. And then it's whatever criteria you decide you want to use. And I'm not a huge fan of lists, so it's what's the most appropriate team? Are they the best performances that have happened? Are they the best players that spanned a career? Are they guys that I played with on the international field or against them, or the best pure individual performance? You know, it's hard. And there was guys that were playing when I was playing that I didn't play against, and I haven't put those in either. And that was kind of difficult because some of those players were just extraordinary. So it put me in a little bit of a spin on Monday.
Okay, well, good. Nice to start the week in a way that gets the old synapses firing and the little grey cells working. What were your own criteria then? So you didn't include anybody you hadn't actually played against on the field of play, is that?
I didn't. I have them kind of they're on the list because they're all, some of them are worth a mention. I think if I take one in particular, and I was trying to make certain that I hadn't played against him, but I don't think I played against Laurent Caban, but I did play with him, and he was one of the top 3 or 4 players I played with in my whole career. He was a French wing forward. He, apart from the fact he was unbelievably good crack, he had a talent that was almost embarrassing. He was so good. He was very slight, had been in a car accident when he was younger, couldn't do a huge amount of weights, but could do things on a rugby field that I've never seen anybody else be able to do. So, wow. And he isn't on the list. He's in my sort of further reaches, but he doesn't make the team because I don't think I played against him. So I have one more I think I'll talk about, actually same position, Richard Hill, who I played against often, and he played 6 for England. But when he played 7 for the Lions, I thought he was the best 7 I ever played with. Wow. I thought he was truly, truly amazing. But he doesn't make it either. So that's a little bit frustrating. And I've also taken the view of players who were excellent, but may not have got the credit that they deserved, but their quality all the time was amazing. So I think it starts with that. Actually, that's the easiest way to go, is to start at 1, which I went with Tom Smith. Because now I played with Tom in 5 Lions tests, and he was never considered such a huge star for the very simple reason he wasn't a huge man, and there were far bigger guys. And you had Oz Durant, who was there, and Christian Califano, who I played against often, who was quite extraordinary. But Tom seemed never to make a mistake ever, and was so unbelievably consistent, but fought against the challenge of being half the size of some of the guys he was against. I mean, he was extraordinary. So so my criteria are all mixed up, without a shadow of a doubt. I think it's a really good team in my time, but I know that everybody has their own opinion. Everybody's going to come with their own one in relation to it. But Tom was magic.
It is a pretty good team. I'll get to that 1 second. So just for anybody who's watching and is unfamiliar, what's the era here? What are the years that are qualifying for you?
And the years to qualify for me are, I joined the Ireland squad in 92. Actually 92, I played from 94 to 2003. So there were some pretty stunning players in that period of time. I also included a Babas game. We played South Africa in 94 because some of the players that played on that day were just off the chart, but were off the chart in terms of maybe the history of the game as well.
Okay, well, I was wondering what Richard Hill, and then I'm like, okay, I see why. So Tom Smith is your number one, and on the list of other potential number ones, there were loads of other great players. But when you were playing against Tom Smith, what was that like?
It was kind of the joy of playing with him and the joy of playing against him was almost flip sides of a coin. He never said anything ever at any stage. So you never knew whether you had him under pressure. You never knew whether anything was going against him in any way, shape or form. He bore his roles and responsibilities at scrum time in particular with total silence. So he never seemed to be under pressure. He never showed any pain in any way, shape or form. He had the most extraordinary hands then. I mean, if there was a player from my era that would suit the way expansive rugby is going now, it was Tom Smith. He had the most extraordinary hands. And I was telling a story the other day that was kind of a criticism against a couple of scrum halves. And someone said they thought, because I was watching it with Tom Smith, they thought that I was going to tell the story that Tom went into scrum half to pass the ball the 25 yards because he had that skill set. So it was the consistency of people can be consistent and not consistently good. He was consistently fantastic all the time. He just didn't make any mistakes. So to have a player like that in the front row was extraordinary.
Tom, of course, passed away at a very reasonably young age as well, Keith, earlier this year. Sad to see that, but a lot of the tributes that came in, and I was just reading one there from when he passed away. One of the great props of all time. So even if you hadn't played against him, you probably have him up there as one of the great props.
Well, he played 5 lines tests in a row. 6 lines tests in a row, and in the front row, that's incredible. That's just incredible. And the guy always said it, so I'll go back to something. There's obviously nostalgia in terms of this, but having toured with him in '97 and then having not played with him but played against him for the 4 years in between, and then playing with him again in 2001. It was just incredibly comfortable. There was no issue. It was as if we'd been playing together for the 4 years in between. It was as if, he knew exactly what I needed, and he just did it. He just did his job incredibly well. Yeah,
he's a good fella. I think that's the other thing. I know he's a patron of charities and gave of his time willingly. And we probably won't spend as long talking about everybody else. We definitely could, but I do know that he was a good fella too.
Oh, yeah, sure. He was class. He was my roommate for a lot of the Lions tours, so I got used to him. I think I described it when he passed away that there's one person who wouldn't shut up and the other person never spoke at all, so we're perfect roommates. But pretty magic guy.
Mario Ledesma and Jason Leonard are the rest of that front row. Talk to us about them.
Well, Ledesma, for me, it's like I played against him a good bit in Argentina. He was vying with Federico Mendes. For me, Mendes was stronger. It was like he was a beast. He was a prop. But actually, if you put pressure on him for striking, he wasn't comfortable. Unfortunately for Ledesma, there was nothing you could do to put him off in terms of the scrum, and I thought that became very important in terms of this. He was. I played a cup final against him. They were playing Narbonne Challenge Cup. He was playing for Narbonne, and I actually didn't recognise my wife after the game. And it was out of pure, unadulterated fatigue, having played 80 minutes against him in the front row. Now, I did play 30 minutes extra time in the back row that day, and that was another reason for it. But I hated playing against him. He's another really good guy, but I hated playing against him because of that pressure. And on the list of guys I have there, I'd Phil Kearns in there, I'd Ibanez in there, John Schmidt, Mark Del Masso. And I also had Garen Jenkins, who a lot of guys may not know enough of, but he was the hardest guy I ever scrummed against. He was very short and very difficult to play against. But Ledesma, for me, tops it. For Jason, I went for Jason because he plays on both sides of the scrum. I played with him and against him. I played with him for Quins and for the Lions. But we played side by side for 7 years with Harlequins. But he was like he started at 20 years of age playing for England and went all the way through the old style of rugby with Dooley and Dean Richards and all that guys from England, that hard side, all the way into the professional one, to playing on the lines, to playing in a World Cup, to winning a World Cup. I thought he fit the bill. I had Ola Brown in there as well, which some of the older listeners would remember, but he was at the very end of his career, so I never got to see him at his absolute best when I played against him.
Okay. The second row, Martin Johnson and John Eales. That's not bad.
No, I think, like Jono was the best captain I ever played with or against. I also think his performance as a second row in the World Cup final in 2003 was the best performance. I was going to say the best performance I've ever seen by a second row, but then you look at John Eales, whose nickname was Nobody because nobody's perfect. I still am stunned when I look at him with his huge feet, kicking conversions and penalties from all over the field for Australia. When they brought in line-out lifting, he often said, no, I don't like being lifted. I can jump high enough on my own. So when you were throwing into the line-out against Australia, you would have a pod at the front, a pod at the back, and John Eales at 6'9" or 10, jumping on his own almost to the same height. It was almost impossible to win the ball. And that's my excuse. I'm sticking to it if I can. But he was just extraordinary. Now, both of those guys captained their teams as well to win World Cups. I think that's another reason.
Both leaders, Keith, like are certain positions here as well. Do you notice personality traits that are quite similar? Like I know John and Martin both leaders, but do you notice that, generally speaking, from former teammates, that certain positions nearly have personality traits?
Well, I think Martin would be an enforcer. I don't think John Eales would be. Martin was not the most chatty, would have relied on other guys around him to do that. His level of aggression was fantastic, but equally well, I think he grew as a leader as he got older. I mean, he was made captain of the Lions in '97. He wasn't English captain at the time. Lawrence Delalio was, and that was the decision that was made by Ian McGeechan, and he was the right man for it, And there are traits definitely, but whether they go for position or for people, I think it's more for people.
Your back row, right, is Reuben Krueger, Francois Pienaar and Zinzan Brooke. Who's Reuben Krueger?
Reuben Krueger was... my first introduction to Reuben Krueger was in the Babas against South Africa in 1994. He actually broke my nose, so I know that I have a picture of him holding my jersey, and the next movement is a bit of a swinging arm, and he broke my nose. Reuben was, he was this tough teak, 6 or 7, and South Africa often used 6 as an open side, not a blind side. But he was central to that South African team at that period of time, and so I played against him for 3 or 4 years. He was an incredibly good guy. Another guy who sadly passed away. Incredibly tough, hard, of that time. And actually, when I looked at this by picking both Krueger and Francois Pienaar, I was kind of picking. That's maybe some of the criteria or the latitude that I've taken, is the idea of having players that were great at that moment in time, even though there happened to be other great players I may have played against later on in my career. Those two seem to stand out for me. Now, I could have gone for Andre Venter as well in the back, and we've already talked about Caban and Richard Hill, or Michael Jones. I just never got the chance to play against Michael Jones, and he was spectacular. I did play with and against Dave Wilson for Australia. He was very good. And I played against Richie McCaw a couple of times at the very start of his career. I played in his first cap. And of course, Richie went on to be one of the all-time greats, of course. But I still felt there was something at that moment in that time that those two players together seemed to be phenomenal in Krueger and Pienaar.
That actually, I think, Keith, highlights how seriously you're taking this criteria. So a broken nose from Reuben Krueger and you still pick him in the team.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, but I thought he was class. And Pienaar, of course, I think there is the iconic imagery of Mandela in Francois' number 6 jersey in '95. I spent a bit of time with Francois. He's still statesman-like in many respects, but I do think that was a defining moment in my rugby career. Was that idea of that history of that coming together for '95.
How good a player was Pinar?
Pinar was he's still an incredibly big man. I mean, it's quite hard to because we all diminish as we get older, and he still is a big bear of a man. I think he was cut short. I think that's another reason. I think he could have played for a good few years longer and didn't. And but we saw him. I played against him a fair bit when he was with Saracens as well, and he was very impressive.
Zinzan Brooke is your number 8. Am I right? I have in my head that Zinzan Brooke was another man who liked to kick an old drop goal.
Well, he could put them over, which was one of the great joys of Zinny. I played with and against Zinny for a lot. He was the most outrageously talented player. He has said subsequently that he learned all his skills playing Gaelic football. He was best friends with the McCahills growing up outside Auckland when they were growing up, and they played Gaelic football constantly, and he played all the time, and that's where he thinks he got all his hand-eye coordination and skills, and I wouldn't doubt him. He's a total sports Billy, but he would make the right decision. I mean, the drop goal he got against, I think it was England in the semi-final in the World Cup in '95, on the hoof from 45 yards, straight over the bar. I mean, that's Jonah Lomu caused carnage that day, but that was the nail in the coffin.
I think the new interview Zinzan for us, Keith, around the 2019 Rugby World Cup at one point as well in Dublin.
Yeah. So Zinny is we used to have bets over who'd get the next drop goal when we played for Queen's together, which I will admit, and I admitted then, I think that I won that bet, but he never paid me, so I'm holding out for that one definitely. I managed to scoop a dead duck of a drop goal over against Northampton, but he did it on the international stage. He did it with comfort. He practiced all day, every day. He just everybody would talk about him being natural. He was natural because he was first out to training. He may not have been the fittest at the end of his career, and he wasn't, but he was still able to get a ball to bounce whatever way he wanted to because he practiced it all the time.
Your halfback partnership is George Gregan and Stephen Larkham.
That's the one now where I struggle on myself now. I really struggle because I struggle with not picking Johnny Wilkinson, though I loved Andrew Mertens. And again, he was very old school. And I always thought he was kind of a boring sort of guy until I met him, and he's the least boring guy you'll ever meet. But George Gregan and Stephen Larkham, like George and I are the same age. His durability at 9, it was extraordinary. I'd say he could still play today if you asked him. He's in unbelievable condition. But Stephen Larkham, with that Australian team, I think it originally came from the sort of philosophies of Bob Templeton back in the 80s. But that ability to play and see and run different lines from anybody else were truly extraordinary, and the pair of them they broke my heart on many occasions, on every occasion actually. That's the reason they get picked. They were absolutely phenomenal. I only managed to beat Australia once, and that was with the Lions, and which is a horrible statistic. And they were central to that for all of it, pretty much. Larkham in particular used ghost. And it was before the fully structured defensive line. And if there was the hint of a gap, he had an ability to kind of accelerate on a sort of obscure line and ghost into a space and always have somebody outside him. And look, when we go to the centres, I could have had the two Australian centres at the same time because they were world class at that stage. But I haven't, because I've decided to go for something a bit different. Okay,
so just to some of the other players at 9 and 10 that are close but not actually on the list: Justin Marshall, Rob Howley, Yusuf van der Vesthuizen and Fabian Galtier are the scrum halves. The other halves, you mentioned Mertens. Johnny Wilkinson doesn't make it. It's he was pretty good.
Yeah, Johnny was extraordinary, but again, it was in the time that I toured with Johnny, and I played with him and against him. But in terms of a pure line breaker 10, which I don't always like that, but for a guy that sets the place on fire, Stephen Larkham and George Gregan, and I put them together. And I also decided I didn't do this on every one of them. In fact, I absolutely didn't, but I did go for 9 and 10 who knew each other perfectly.
Yeah.
So Johnny will, whether he cares or doesn't care or not, will be upset or not, But that was the hardest one for me, was the Stephen Larkham or Johnny Wilkinson.
Yeah, I can see why. They're very different players, and maybe if it was for a long campaign, you might pick Johnny Wilkinson. But if it's Space Jam, as we said, the aliens are coming, and you need to beat them, I might stick Larkham in there because he's going to do something and nobody's going to have a clue what it is. What about Van der Westhuizen? Because there was, again, I'm sure there were scrum halves before him who were as strong and as tall and of that athletic profile. But there haven't been a heap of them. Traditionally the scrum half would have been more Gregan's shape and size and technique. But Van der Westhuizen is was he 6'3", 6'4"?
Van der Westhuizen, he was a big man. He was a force of nature. He didn't have as good a pass as Georgie. And I would have said he was... It's funny because you look at Uist and you think he may be the best rugby player on that list of names, but not necessarily the best 9, and so that's and that's one of the reasons. I think George had played longer, played an awful lot more, but was technically fantastic. Uist was the best running 9. Best defending 9, one of the best kicking 9s, at that time. But as I said, this is not an exact science, and I can be challenged on every single one of these, and I'll fail in answering some of them too.
You've got John Lomu on the wing, and the list of other wingers who it could have been are Campese, Yain Evans, and Philippe Saint-André. As depth charts go, that's pretty bloody deep.
It is, and it's funny because I've Lomu on one wing, and I think we should talk about the other wing as well at the same time. But if we talk about Lomu first, when Lomu came on the scene, I think it was 94 Hong Kong Sevens. I think that's where the world suddenly got to notice him. I mean, 2 years prior, he had played against he played for New Zealand schools against the Ireland schools. He played at number 8 against Anthony Foley, and both of them have since passed away, which is terrible. But so we would have known about him a little from then, but then suddenly 94, he comes on, causes total carnage, and the Sevens, goes onto the World Cup, and we now have Jonah Lomu rugby because of that as a thought and an idea. And he changed pretty much everything. He was the first global superstar. He changed, I think, he became the face of the sort of potential of what professionalism could be at that stage in 95. And he was extraordinary, incredibly nice guy, quiet guy, considerate guy, but changed the game, I would have said.
I remember asking Rog this question, Keith, a couple of years ago regarding Jonah Lomu. He talked about trying to hang on to his bootlaces when he was coming towards him. What's going through your head when Jonah Lomu is running full speed towards you on a pitch?
Well, I gotta say fear, but there isn't fear. I don't think so. Anyway, you're thinking about commitment. And I remember going to tackle him at one stage, and I said I'd get him exactly in the right spot, just above the knee. And for all intents and purposes, it was like hitting a force field that you'd see in Star Trek or something. I don't know that I actually hit him, but I didn't knock him or nothing seemed to happen. I mean, the best guy I knew to tackle him was Peter Stringer. And Stringer he used to get tangled up in his feet, and that was the way of knocking him over. I mean, he was huge, absolutely huge. Really, really big. Just like, what he was 6'5" or 6. I think, 6'5" or 6, 17 and a half, 18 stone, moving at an unbelievable clip. It's not fear, but may not be fully entirely filled with confidence that you're going to do the job.
You mentioned the other wing at the same time, so it's Jason Robinson getting in ahead of Joe Roth. What is it that made Jason Robinson be in your team again? I suppose ahead of Campese and Ian Evans and PSA as well.
Yeah, look, I put them all in at different times, and actually, I'm always getting 11s and 14s wrong. So whoever wants to kind of criticise which players are picked on which side, you can. I'll take whatever that. The reason I went for Jason Robinson at that time was, again, I thought he changed a lot of the game. I thought he became, he was an incredible convert to rugby union, having played rugby league at such an incredible level, having done everything in that game. He then moved over to union. He got kind of picked a little bit early on the Lions tour in 2001. I think it was probably a big call to pick him until you saw him at training, and then it wasn't a big call at all. And he was so. I when I played against him and I trained against him, it was fear, because it wasn't a fear of being run over. It wasn't, there was no bodily fear. It was embarrassment. His nickname was Billy Whiz, which was a really good nickname for him. He was like a swirling dervish. You literally couldn't. You couldn't get hands on him. He could stop on the spot and step left and step right. You'd fresh air at different times. Not many players would do that. He could do that incredibly, to the fact that he then went on a Lions tour and then continued on with England afterwards. I thought he was incredible. Now there's so many other guys that could have been there, but I just thought at that time he was the best convert at that stage.
Campese, you kind of missed the peak Campese. Is that one of the reasons?
Well, that's it. That's the reason. I mean, look, I've often talked about Campese because he played in the first tests that I played, and he lost some of his pace. But what he learnt in his last year or two was how to kick the ball 65 yards on a parallel straight down the pitch, left and right. So he lost the pace, but he was still the best kicking option that was in the game, which was pretty amazing. And of course, it could have gone with him just as easy. And he was extraordinary. And it's funny, when I go back to thoughts and times when I wasn't playing, before I played, his pass to Timmy Horn for the try in the semi-final of the World Cup in '91, which he sidesteps and runs to the touchline and just little tip back in over his shoulder, knowing that Tim Horn would be there. It went down as the moment of that World Cup, but it was just sublime skill.
Yeah. One quick question about Ian Evans. He's kind of, for a whole generation, is more a pundit than a player. So what was he like as a player?
Well, I think Ian was I'm not old enough to remember a lot of the 70s rugby, but I've watched a lot of the 70s rugby of that great team. The great Welsh team that beat England consistently and won Grand Slams. They were pretty phenomenal. There was a bit of a gap then afterwards, and I think Ian plugged that gap. Ian was just a flyer, but an incredible finisher, and so he had an ability to evade. When there was space on the field, he found the space, and he was an incredible link man, but he didn't need to link for the most part himself. He was going to score. And look, I was very fortunate to get the chance to tour with him. I called him Dad actually on the tour in '97, and he was the oldest guy on that trip. And he played the first test, got injured afterwards. But I didn't get to play against him enough for him to be there. That would be the reason why he wasn't there.
Fair enough.
Unbelievable. I mean, he was exciting, so he would have set the place alight.
Right. That's a really important kind of thing in picking these teams, and that power of nostalgia as well. So Christian Cullen is your fullback. It's fair to say that so many Irish rugby fans don't really fully appreciate Christian Cullen because his time in Munster was so unfortunately injury blighted. But when we're talking about setting the place alight and being exciting, there's very few people ever who've had the kind of impact that Christian Cullen had when he got the ball in his hands.
Look, if we look at some of the others, we've Emile Ntamak, or as Pat Whelan used to call him, Natamak, Andre Joubert, Jeff Wilson. I even put Gavin in there because Gavin was very important for rugby at the time. But Christian set the world alight. He had the best running style of any fullback I'd seen. Now, he was playing in an incredible team, but he picked the best line consistently. But it was the zigzagging of his run. It was his accelerating onto a ball, accelerating into a space. He'd have these crazy arcing runs and then absolutely like destroying the opposition with a step. And he stepped off both legs incredibly well. He just set the place on fire. We didn't get to see the best of him when he played in Ireland with Munster. His knees were shot, and you know, if you're talking about a stepping fullback and his knees aren't working, we're never going to see the best, and that was very unfortunate for him. And he didn't get the chance to end out his career as he would have liked to. But I can't remember his stats. But his stats were a try a game nearly for his whole career. He was just extraordinary, and for me, he wasn't a big man either. And I just thought he was like kind of Roy the Rover stuff when you saw him at 15.
The last two then are obviously the centres. We skipped over those. So the ones who didn't make it: Tim Horan, Jason Little, and Frank Bunce. So this is going to have to be a good centre partnership, and it's not bad. Jeremy Guscott and Scott Gibbs. Speaking of converts, so
yeah, well, Gibbsy was rugby first, then went to rugby league,
okay,
and then came back to rugby. So that was why I'd said that in that fashion. Jeremy was. He was the prince of centres, you know, and I have them at 12 and 13 because they often wore different jerseys. He did with England, but Jerry was a 13 for the most part. But his ability to show and go, and again, I think it's different because the game has changed an awful lot. So you wouldn't have as much space to show and go now because the defensive line is far straighter. But he had incredible acceleration, and also which I would have said, you know, he was selfish enough to go for it and to score, but he also knew when to make the pass. And I thought he was a fantastic passer at the right time. He was a great man to put a fullback or a winger away, and did that consistently. Gibbsy was, and I played against him, and I played with him. He was about as destructive as it comes as a 12. He was extraordinary. And I mean, it changed the game. People might think that it's changed the game to the negative because there's so little space, but he was as he was described as the fastest prop who ever played in the centre, you know, fastest prop in the world. But he was absolute solid, total tank. And the two of them got on unbelievably well. And again, that was one of those very easy partnerships to see on a lines tour. They were just incredibly comfortable with it. And like I often talk about the fact that in the second test in '97, Jeremy played very quietly. He didn't have a huge amount to do. Scott Gibbs did a colossal amount of work. Jeremy didn't do a huge amount. I'm going to say the game was drifting him by to some degree until he had to make his one telling element, which was to score his first ever drop goal, which was magnificent.
Frank Bunce just missing out to Scott Gibbs, Keith. I know you played against Frank plenty of times, an All Blacks legend.
Not plenty of times, no. I only played against times. I think I only played against him once, but that was at the end of his career. But he is one of the guys that I would have grown up and watched, and there was him and Walter Little and Stanley, but Frank Bunce was amazing, great hands, great physicality, like a really good blend. But again, I didn't play against him enough. Didn't see him enough at his pomp.
Was there anybody who you'd like to have played against that you didn't?
Sean Fitzpatrick.
All right.
Sean isn't in the list of hookers. Of course, he should be in the list of hookers, but he isn't because I didn't play against him. He got injured and pulled out about 3 days before we played them in '97. but he was the totem pole to the change of what hooker play was, and ball carrying forwards, sort of different roles that started 10 years previously with Fitzy. And his longevity was truly extraordinary. He played 58 or 60 tests without missing a minute, and like extraordinary stuff, but so I didn't get the chance to play against him. Of course, there's loads that you look at that you'd say. Serge Blanco, who was as a kid was my favorite player. I'd Philippe Saint-André down on that list. There was a load of French guys that played in the 80s that were extraordinary, and they played this wonderful style of rugby. You'd love to have been able to play that or to see that as well, with their pristine white shorts against Ireland as well, where they haven't even touched the ground. I played in a couple of those too, so there's no fun in that either. But yeah, I mean, when you look back at the list, you think there's some pretty wonderful players in there, and so that's it was a really interesting time of rugby because rugby was changing, and so you saw and that team, I think, is a reflection of some of the old and the new. Yeah, great stuff, Keith. Brilliant. Thanks a million. I'm glad you wasted your Monday so that we could spend some time with you on the Wednesday. It was great. Okay, cheers, gents. Good luck. So great stuff there from Keith Wood, picking the best 15 he played against.